Good evening, everyone. It looks like we have many people joining us in the room. I am pleased that you are joining us here this evening. My name is Stacia Stelk, and I'm the Executive Director of Deep Roots, and I have the privilege of working with so many habitat and native plant experts that, what a great job to learn something new every day, right? So we are thrilled to have so many of you joining us virtually for our annual spring workshop series. This series is generously presented by the Arvin L. Gottlieb Foundation with support from Mid-America Regional Council and the Missouri Department of Conservation. After the program, please visit deeproots.org, where you can find out where to buy native plants, attend additional educational programs, or sign up for our newsletter. So a few housekeeping details as we get going this evening. Please take a moment to locate the chat and Q&A tools at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions, please put them in Q&A box as they come to you, and we'll dedicate a little time at the end of our presentation for questions. We are thrilled to have Hilary Noonan with us this evening. Hilary is principal of Syntax Land Design and Mad Hatter Compost Tea. Her work focuses on issues of resilience and soil health. She holds a master's degree in landscape architect from Kansas State University and a bachelor's of arts from Yale. She has certification as a permaculture designer. She has studied with soil microbiologists and farmers in her quest for defining regenerative design. She continues her education at every opportunity and has the good fortune to study with some of her heroes. Please join me in welcoming Hilary Noonan. Hilary, please come to our virtual stage.
Thank you, Stacia, and thank you, Mary, for handling all the technical stuff. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight. It seems like sometimes I just go from Zoom call to Zoom call, so I really appreciate your coming to the presentation tonight. I'd also like to thank the Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation for giving me the time and space to think through the ideas that are here and the drawings that were developed for them. And I'd also like to thank Hoxie Collective and Hubbard Studio for their feedback during that process. It was invaluable. So as Stacia mentioned, I got my master's in landscape architecture at K-State. And I did an internship in 2007 at an architecture firm. They were talking about regenerative design in buildings. And I thought, well, don't we have a lot more opportunity outside the building? It's really cool to have regenerative design in buildings, but I want to do it outside. So I started searching for it. I found permaculture, which went partway to it, but didn't quite get far enough into the science to really explain why some things work and some things don't. So I kept looking, and somebody pointed me toward a woman named Elaine Ingham. And I could take a class with her in Connecticut if I could get there. So I went to Connecticut and spent 3 days getting an introduction to soil microbes and getting back on a microscope, which I hadn't done in years. And it was so much fun. So, when we generally talk about soil, when we think about soil, we go to this triangle. This is what we were taught in school. But really, this just describes physical properties. It's clay, or it's sandy, it's silty, or it's loamy. But soil is more than a shape or a texture, and it's not simply what holds your plant. So soil is part of a beautifully complex system, and that system is part of larger systems. When you affect one part of the soil system, that effect ripples through not only that system, but the systems that it's a part of. So when I first started talking about this stuff, it was hard to find the way to express it and make it clear. Then a couple of years ago, I found this organization, Kiss the Ground, really terrific organization. And they didn't dumb it down, but very elegantly simplified it to 5 soil health principles. So we have living root, soil armor, biodiversity, least disturbance, and wildlife and animal integration. And along with those 5 principles, there are 4 things that I want you to keep in mind when you're thinking about them. Number 1, soil and water systems do not function separately. So when your soil is in good shape, water infiltrates into it. Your soil, when it's in good shape, has about 50% airspace. And so water can move through it quickly and easily. It also holds on to more water. Every gram of carbon can hold 8 grams of water. So when things are working well, soil and water work together really well. When your soil's not in good shape, water's not going to infiltrate through it. It's going to wash over the top and you're likely to have erosion. Number 2, time affects all the principles. So the response you get from the actions you take for the plants in the soil will differ by time of year. We're used to thinking about that with plants, but not so much with soil. 3, damage and entropy happen. Doesn't make a very good bumper sticker, but there are times when you have to do damage. There are ways that we do damage that we don't realize we're doing damage. Lawn chemicals damage soil. If you want to get rid of the grass to make a new garden bed, you're digging it over, you're actually damaging soil. And certainly when there's something like construction, cars driving over soil, all that sort of thing, all of that creates damage. And entropy happens. This used to be the Great Plains. There were bison roaming here, large ruminant animals. And so having ruminant animals like bison or cattle or goats or sheep, they're like 4-legged compost tea machines. The rumen in their gut is what brings a fresh set of microbes to the soil. So people talk about using manure on their soil. When you're using manure from a ruminant animal, it's really much more the microbes that are important than any kind of nutrient value from the manure. So without entropy, or because of entropy, without ruminant animals, we have to take the place of that animal to make sure that we have the microbes. And number 4, don't forget number 1. You can't fix the whole system if you only affect one part. So if you damage one part, it ripples through the whole system and creates damage in other parts. To fix it, you have to mitigate more than that one part that got damaged. You have to mitigate for all the parts that got damaged. So then we have 4 strategies. And because those 5 principles are so interrelated, that can actually simplify solutions. So the 4 strategies are compost and a diverse microbial community. And I'm talking about biologically active compost. I've never seen a commercially or municipally produced compost that is actually sufficiently alive to get the kind of response you want to get from a really good compost. I have seen compost made on small scale that's really terrific, but never on a large scale. So, and James Sotillo, the late James Sotillo, really terrific guy, did projects all across the country, never found commercially produced compost that actually had what you needed in it. Now, the composter may be adding fungi that their whole job is to break down organic matter, and it makes sense to add it. It helps the composting process. But that's not the kind of fungi that you're talking about when you're talking about mycorrhizae. That mycorrhizal fungi that's really important. You may get some spores. You're probably not going to get much diversity. So you may need to add that. And there are some great products out there. Getting to know the people who are making them can really help you find a good product. Finding people who use them and asking them is a good way to go as well. And when I'm talking about diversity, I'm talking about thousands, tens of thousands of species. So if you see something that has a few of these and a few of those, that's not even a glancing blow to when it comes to diversity. Having said that, any compost is better than no compost. So if you're making compost in your backyard or your front yard like me, you may not have the time or the inclination to go out and take the temperature and pay attention to this and make sure it's at this percentage of moisture and all that sort of thing. So you may not have the microbial community that you'd really like to have, but it is organic matter. It will benefit. You may need to add something to it, but you know, if you don't have a microscope and you can't look at it, or you don't want to spend $150 sending it off for a soil food web test, and maybe you do want to do that. If you don't want to do that, well, put it in your garden and see what happens. If you don't get the kind of response from plants that you were hoping for, it may be that you don't have the microbes in it that you want to have. If you have a lot of pest insect pressure, it may be that the plants are not able to access the minerals they need to make the plant healthy and pest resistant. Plants that aren't healthy literally attract pest insects. It's nature's way. If something is not healthy, kill it off quickly so those elements can go back into the soil and something healthy can grow there in its place. So if you see a lot of insect pest pressure, it probably means that you don't have the microbial community that you want to have. And so you need to take a step to help that along. Revegetate, reseed or replant as soon as you can after getting your compost and microbes on the soil. And because your soil will be in much better shape, you can actually buy smaller plants and they'll grow much faster. I have a bur oak in my front yard that was literally 6 inches tall when I got it from my permaculture teacher. He just grabbed an acorn, stuck it in a pot of soil. When it was 6 inches tall, I bought it from him, brought it home, and had to put fencing around it so the runny babbits wouldn't eat it. But in 6 years, it was as tall as my 2-story house. It's taller than my 2-story house now, and for a tree that's supposed to be so slow growing, I think that's pretty fast, and it's because the soil's in good shape. Sometimes with soil damage, you can lose minerals. So you may need to rebalance minerals. But let me give you an idea of a good way of thinking about it. So this graphic was made by an excellent farmer. His name is John Kempf. He does free webinars that are very, very worthwhile watching. Terrific guy. The top of the circle is macronutrients. The bottom is micronutrients. The left half is cations. So those are minerals that have a positive charge. The right side is anions, so those are minerals with a negative charge. And so these things balance each other. And one of the reasons he put this together is that he found that if any one of those quadrants, if you have an overabundance of one, say, macrocation, you are likely to have not enough of another micro or macrocation. So we have soil that is mostly weathered from limestone, which has tons of calcium in it. Our water from our municipal systems has an average pH of 10 because we have so much bicarbonate, but the water is moving through limestone, it's picking up calcium. So because we have so much calcium, we are likely to be deficient in one of the other macrocations. So you can also tell by looking at this number one, let me say, in damaged soil, you're more likely to leach anions. And so with something like boron or molybdenum down there in the lower right, you need very small amounts of this in your soil. Boron, it's 3 parts per acre, yeah. sorry, there's something, is it 3 parts per million? Molybdenum, it's even less. However, if you don't have it, your plants can't make the enzymes that they need to make to be pest resistant. Now, if you have boron over here and 30 feet away over in another part of the yard, you have a plant that needs boron. If you have a good mycorrhizal network, then you will have boron for this plant. If you don't have that mycelium crossing your yard, which isn't the easiest thing to get, if you don't have that there, then this plant that needs the boron isn't going to get it. So the slower process is to make sure you have the mycorrhizae in place within the plant, that you have the mycelium between the plants. That could take a few years. It's worth doing. If your plants are really in rough shape, or you want to make sure that you have nutrient-dense vegetables, say, that you're raising, then it may be worthwhile doing the test so you can add something that is missing. I will say David Johnson has done some studies that are absolutely fascinating. Did a soil test. It didn't show, I think it was potassium, didn't show any potassium in the soil that he was working in at New Mexico State. And yet when he did a tissue test at the end of the season, he had potassium showing up in the leaves. So how did it get to the leaf? It wasn't in the soil. If you don't need to add minerals, don't add minerals. If you have a good reason for adding minerals, then please get a soil test to check first before just adding NPK or one of the other things that may bring you trace minerals. They may not be the trace minerals you need. So let me go back for a minute to minimize disturbance. When I say minimize disturbance, what I really mean is kick the habit. Don't use pre-emergent or other herbicides, fungicides, pesticides, synthetic fertilizers. They tend to kill off some part of the microbial community in the soil. And once you kill it off, the whole system collapses, tends to collapse. Your soil tends to go highly bacterial, gets compacted, and then you have a mess to deal with. Minimizing disturbance, not using the chemicals, will go a long way toward getting you to healthy soil. And I've seen a study that someone put out that said, oh, don't worry about glyphosate. Go ahead and use glyphosate because it actually increases bacterial action in the soil. Well, yes, it does. But guess what? You so overbalance your soil with bacteria, you're on your way to your soil going anaerobic. It's going to chew up your fungi. The very base sort of ratio that you want to have in your soil is 1-to-1 fungi to bacteria. And annuals are okay with that, but sort of the further you get in a successional planting, the more fungal. If you're doing orchard plantings with fruit trees or shrubs, they like a highly fungal soil. So if you use glyphosate on something, you're going to have bacteria chewing up your fungi. Your plants are going to be very unhappy, and your production is going to go way down. And there are studies that have shown that. So let's get to what illustrations, essentially, of the soil principles. So biodiversity is one of the principles. And I wanted to go to this one first because it's just beautiful when everything works together. This is what it looks like when it's healthy. And the place to start on these drawings is it'll either be a big green circle or red hexagon if it's a problem. So our big green circle is biodiverse plantings. And if you've read, say, Doug Tallamy, You have an idea, oh yeah, I want all these different plants because then I'm going to get all these different animals and I'm going to get all these different pollinators and insects and wonderful things. And all of that is true, but it's even better because you have the diverse plantings above the ground. You're going to have diverse biology in the soil. Christine Jones in Australia found that when she used a cover crop on soil with 16 different seeds, 16 different varieties of seed, she got a good deal of carbon building in the soil. When she used 32 different species, she got twice as much carbon. It's in part because you're getting such a diversity of microbes, because different plants will feed different microbes. They may all be feeding fungi, they may all be feeding bacteria, but it's different species. And getting those different species is important. And it actually affects photosynthesis within the plants. So your plants are actually photosynthesizing more. Most farmers would be happy with getting 10% photosynthesis. John Kempf actually gets up to 60% photosynthesis in his plants because he takes care of the soil to take care of the plant. When you get that kind of photosynthesis going, you're pulling so much more carbon into the plant and you're storing so much more of it in the soil. You actually flip the numbers on transpiration from the soil. So instead of having 90% of that carbon coming back out of the soil, you're only losing about 11% of it. And if you have lots of good leaves covering that soil, they're actually going to pick up that carbon as it's transpiring from the soil and send it back through the plant again. So if we follow the arrows from this center part, attracting diverse birds means you're adding to diversity because they carry seed. They're going to drop it in your garden for more diversity. They're going to drop it in other places for more diversity. That bird poo itself is organic material. And the microbes at the higher trophic levels are actually going to break that down into things, and it's going to feed more microbes. The birds are there to pollinate plants. Pollinating plants is helping your garden, of course. You're going to attract diverse insects. Again, my cursor keeps disappearing. Diverse insects, follow the arrows. Beneficial insects are going to eat pest insects and break down organic material within the soil. That's feeding a diverse microbial community. The diverse microbial community is out there mining and making minerals available to the plant. And it's actually going to send mineral into the plant. One of the ways that it gets to the plant is bacterial will go inside the root of the plant into that mycorrhizae. It actually like swims around within that mycorrhizal fungi that's in the root of the plant. And the fungi produces a chemical that breaks down the outer coating on the bacteria, releases the mineral to the plant, and then that bacteria is actually sent on a root hair back out into the soil to go mine some more and bring it back. It's absolutely amazing. The study is called rhizophagy, and it's just getting to the point where it's being studied more widely. It's absolutely fascinating. And there are some people out there, I'm sure you can find YouTubes on rhizophagy that it's just stunning. They have pictures of it happening. Anyhow, your microbes, you've got all these great microbes. They're building your soil structure. They're building in that 50% airspace, and they're sequestering the carbon in the soil. You don't have to add something to store the carbon. The carbon is being stored in the body of microbes, and that can happen even deep within the soil on tree roots. And so you also don't want to lose those old trees, because if the tree is no longer feeding the fungi dies, that carbon can be released. Anyhow, it's also the microbes are also sending bacteria up through the plant, and the plant, with the evapotranspiration of water vapor, there are also aerosols that are going up into the atmosphere and bacteria. So it's those aerosols, VOCs, and the bacteria that the water vapor actually collects around, forms ice crystals, and that starts rain. So sending more vapor into the air, sending the bacteria and the VOCs into the air is actually helping to create more rain. So that 40% of our weather that we can influence is gonna be influenced by having your soil in good shape with diverse plantings. So it goes way beyond what's coming to your yard, as you can see. So here's sort of the flip side of that. Let's say you just built a new house and they roll out the sod and they drive away, and you've got to unpack and cook and go to the soccer game and all the rest of it, and you haven't put in a garden yet. So you've just got this monoculture of turf grass in your yard. Well, there are a couple of good things about it. You've got some green arrows there. So you've got good play area close to houses. It's a good surface for sports fields. Much better to play on grass than to play on AstroTurf. But because it's all turf, it supplies a limited kinds of food for birds and insects. So you're going to have fewer birds in the area. You're going to have fewer insects in the area. You may have birds coming down to grab worms or grubs, that sort of thing, but you won't have as many as you would if you had a diverse planting. Generally, when you have that monoculture turf, the seeds that are carried by birds are usually considered weeds, and so herbicide gets used on them. You don't have the pollination that you need for plants that need to be pollinated by those birds and insects that aren't coming. You have fewer birds to eat pest insects, so then you use a pesticide to deal with those. Because you've got fewer bugs and spiders and worms, they aren't there to eat insects. You're not going to break down organic matter that lands on the ground. So you may cut that turf and leave it on the ground, but if you don't have the microbes, if you don't have those higher level of trophic insects, et cetera, to start breaking that down to feed microbes, then you're not getting the benefit of leaving the cuttings there. You're not getting that nitrogen return to the soil. Because you're not feeding microbes, then you don't have the microbes to feed nutrient back to your plant. So then because the soil isn't feeding the plant, then you have to feed the plant. So you've got to use fertilizers on that grass to keep it going. You now have a drug addicted rug. Synthetic fertilizers, if you had any semblance of soil microbes before the stuff went down, use the synthetic fertilizers, the pesticide, the herbicide, you've now caused a collapse of your microbial populations. And because some of those minerals are actually embodied in the microbes, once those microbes die, that nutrient, the minerals can leach. You don't have the microbes building the soil structure, they aren't storing water, they aren't holding carbon in the soil. So you're actually increasing the amount of carbon that's respired back into the atmosphere. You're helping to promote global warming. You're also helping to promote erosion and pollution, and you're much more likely to have flooding problems. Additionally, without the microbes, you don't have the same amount of water vapor going up because the plant doesn't have as much water stored in the soil to access. So you don't have the same bacteria and water vapor and VOCs going up to create the rain. So less rains to support the grass, so you have to increase the irrigation. You are taking care of this grass in every way possible. So does that mean you can't have turf grass? No. Absolutely not. There's still good reasons for having turf grass. You still want to have a place for the kids to do somersaults and handstands and cartwheels and all the rest. And it's still a very good surface for sports. So around, if you can downsize that lawn a bit and upsize naturalized areas around it, you can mitigate the effects of that smaller area of monoculture and bring it back to health. So you can have that turf. You can actually store carbon with turf, but the less naturalized areas around it, the more you have to be involved with making sure it has the microbial population, that it's building carbon, et cetera. So again, if you follow the green arrows through the drawing, because you've got more diverse plantings, you've got more bugs and spiders and birds and all the things that go with it. You don't need the herbicide, you don't need the pesticide, you don't need the synthetic fertilizers. And that whole system that affects drought and flood cycles, that affects how much CO2 is in the air, that affects erosion, all of that is managed because you've brought this soil back into better health. I wanted to make sure that we had time. You know, I'm not watching the time. I should be watching the time. Okay. I wanted to go a little bit into types of soil armor because it's something that we do all the time. So there are types of soil armor that are stone or riprap. You know, you go along the highway and you see along the edges of highways, you've got riprap down embankments. I actually have a friend who has the contract in Massachusetts for taking all that riprap off the highways, off the sides, because riprap doesn't actually prevent erosion. You just don't see it. So I would never suggest using riprap. You end up with a whole lot of siltation happening in the water bodies that it's flowing to. It's not a good idea. There are times that stone can be a good mulch, but you have to think about it a little bit. So if you have this big area of stone and your plants are itty bitty, that stone is going to be out in the sun all day. It's going to get really hot. It's going to try to cook that little plant. It's also holding that heat in during the day. So at night, it's reflecting that heat back into the atmosphere. Again, you're contributing to global warming. Now, if you have stone mulch, but you have plants that are shading it, that's a different deal. So if you have plants that are either getting big enough in the spring to cover it, or they're shrubs and they're already big enough, stone could be a viable mulch for you. Wood mulch is the one that we see the most. And it looks very neat in a garden. People like it. It does suppress weeds. It holds in some water in the soil. Most native plants, unless they're native to a woodsy area, they're probably not going to like a wood mulch. If it's a plant that grows naturally in the forest with all that forest detritus on the ground, then it may be perfectly fine with wood mulch. But if it's a plant from out on the prairie where it's not used to having all that woody material on the ground, it's probably not going to be happy with a wood mulch. Hardwood mulch is probably a better choice than pine mulch. Pine mulch is much softer. It has less lignin. And so it goes through a nitrification process much faster, where it's actually pulling nitrogen out of the soil and away from the plants to break down that pine mulch really quickly. So if you're going to use a wood mulch, I would suggest using a hardwood mulch rather than something soft like pine. Wood mulches tend to be hydrophobic, which means in a rain, they tend to get picked up and washed out. And so then you get like 4 inches of matted down mulch because you're determined to keep it there. I've done that before. It does not help with compaction in the soil. It actually helps to compact the soil. So what's better than a wood mulch? Compost, especially when you're first planting an area. Compost is really going to help young plants take off. And weeds that come through are going to be really weak and spindly. So it's really easy to pull them. When I do a new garden bed and I use compost for my mulch that first year, I can weed 100 square feet of garden in 10 minutes. because the weeds are spindly and you can just go out, boop, 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 pull them out. No big deal. Now, not all compost has a healthy microbial population. If the compost is stinky in any way, be really careful with it. Don't put it near new plants at all. It's producing alcohol. Now, it may be producing alcohol because it's not finished composting. It may be producing alcohol because it's finished composting and it's going anaerobic. Either way, those alcohols are not good for plants. And so if you get something like that, like you bought bags of compost and they've been sitting out all winter and they've been saturated and they stink, open those bags out, spread that compost out someplace where it's not going to hurt plants. You know, you can put it in a grassy area, you can put it someplace in the back, someplace where you don't have new plants. Spread it out, let it sit. In fact, if you can open those bags in the fall and let it sit out all winter, that's even better. You can affect a stinky compost. If it isn't too bad, you can affect it with a microbial tea or inoculant by getting good stuff on it. I still wouldn't put it on brand new plants, but you can put it into a more mature bed if you're then following that with a compost tea so that your good microbes are overwhelming bad microbes, and the humate that's in that compost grabs hold of all sorts of things. It's great. So let's see, where does that bring us? Oh, green mulch, the best kind of mulch. Green mulch is a living mulch. So it's a ground cover plant. And the height of that ground cover plant depends on what it's growing underneath. The idea is you want to get leaves covering all the soil. So if you have a plant that's 3 feet tall, as long as that ground cover isn't going to shade it out while it's growing, if they're growing at the same rate, you can have a ground cover plant that's 1 foot tall because the other plant is 3 feet tall. So you're getting layers in here. Sometimes it's a much smaller plant that you need ground cover around. So, you know, maybe something like rose verbena, which is a native plant, really pretty flower, spreads easily. That could be your green mulch. There are lots of ground cover plants that you can use as your green mulch. And it, you know, it's like the Christine Jones things. If you have 32 instead of 16, you're going to store carbon twice as fast. And that carbon is going to help your plants and help the environment. So the idea of wildlife and animal integration, you know, you've got healthy plants and healthy soil, you're attracting animals. If you can send grazers through an area, it's terrific. I have friends who made a deal with vineyard. They got free grazing for sheep and the vineyard got ruminant animals moving through. It was a really good balance there. Whatever the combination is, it's one of the principles to think about. I want to check the time again, make sure we're okay. We're getting short on time. Okay, let me do least disturbance really, really quickly and just point out where there are green arrows, these are positive things. There are times when you may have to do some grading. I have to regrade my backyard, okay? I'm gonna move soil with a skid steer, so I have to mitigate for that damage afterwards. There are times when you may have to break plow pan where you're growing stuff. You may have hoe pan. Somewhere a little bit under where the soil is looser, you've got a really heavy layer. It may be in a raised bed between the soil in the raised bed and the soil underneath. There may be times that you need to break that, then you need to mitigate afterwards. The biocides, well, yes, they kill weeds, they kill plant pathogens, they kill pest insects, they kill root feeding nematodes. Well, they also kill beneficial plants and they kill beneficial bacteria, beneficial fungi, beneficial insects, beneficial nematodes. 95% of nematodes are beneficial. Do you really want to kill all the nematodes to get the 5% that you may not even have? So right here, this microbial community collapse, using the fungicide, the pesticide, the herbicide, the nematicide, all the, the synthetic fertilizers will lead you to a microbial collapse. And you don't have the microbes, more inputs are needed. So I know let's see, how many more? Oh, okay. So the 4 strategies that I talked about before that we saw a little bit in those drawings on the different principles. So now you're ready for actually solving problems. So you've got your problem there in the hexagon, nothing grows. What's the actual cause of nothing growing? Is it because you need to till it, or is it because the plants have no support system in the soil? If that soil is really hard, why is it really hard? If it's washing away with erosion, why is it washing away with erosion? So you look at the principles as sort of your filters in deciding what your strategy is going to be and how you're going to implement it. So looking at the living root, you tried to vegetate it once before, but everything failed. Nothing's growing. So clearly, you want to keep that in mind, but that's not what's going to get you past the problem. So soil armor, what plan has been made that you can now implement to armor that soil? Biodiversity, does the planting or seeding plan reflect that principle? Disturbance, how can you minimize disturbance at this point? Or is there disturbance that you need to make to get to the point where you can mitigate? And wildlife and animal integration. At this point, if nothing's growing, you probably just get raccoons and possum and things that aren't really going to help you reestablish plants. So going to those strategies, the compost and microbes, revegetate, rebalance, minimize disturbance, and then it's a question of how you're going to implement the strategies. And we don't have time to go into that now, but do your plants have the support system they have now? Well, if now they're growing, you got the support system in. If you're still having a problem, then you still have a problem in there somewhere, and you should start back at the beginning and look through those lenses again. So again, I'd like to thank Thunder Valley, CDC, Hoxie Collective, and Hubbard Studio. And there is my information down on the right. And I think I hit 45 minutes. Yay!
Bravo, that was wonderful.
Thank you.
Hilary, thank you so much. That was terrific. Before I jump into, we have a lot of really great questions out there. You were talking about the buffalo and the species who lived on the Great Plains before Western civilization moved in. I remember reading a book and hearing Alan Savory with Holistic Management Talk, and is that sort of similar to what you're talking about?
Yes, adaptive multi-paddock grazing is something that Alan helped develop. He really was at the forefront of that. He was in Zimbabwe, which is where he's from. Right. He had just graduated from grad school. Government said elephants are overgrazing and causing desertification. So they went out and shot a bunch of elephants, and it didn't stop the desertification. He has spent the rest of his life making up for that. And so what he did was, okay, I have one style of learning. He went out and observed in nature, and he watched how quickly predators moved grazing animals. And he started thinking about that. And that's how he gets to this adaptive multi-paddock grazing. So, when you look at a field with cows in it, they're not evenly spaced across that field. They tend to group together, which is how predators move animals. So you make those paddocks much smaller, you move them much faster, usually involves electrified fencing, but you're moving them faster. They don't chew the plant down as far. And there are all sorts of benefits. There's actually a piezoelectric pulse that happens from heavy animals walking across the land that causes fungi in the soil to bloom. So, what do? Do you go out and jump on your soil to replace that? You actually get plants growing. It spurs the plant to create more root growth, which creates more vegetative growth if you pull on the plant. So you're going to go out and pull on the plant while you're jumping. You know, there are ways that we can replace the ruminant animal. But again, it takes more time from us. If you have the ruminant animal, it's going to make that process less expensive for farmers. But not always possible for homeowners.
Well, that's actually one of the questions we have on the in the Q&A related to more of an urban environment. I believe Ellen Savory called them donkey days. And so Michelle asked, what is the best way to deal with soil compaction due to repeated trampling? Could be people walking or perhaps a border collie obsessively running, just as a random example.
Yeah, boy, I had a dog who just wore pads in the yard. So it depends on how intense the problem is, how long it's been going on, how wide the path is. With, say, horses, you can actually let them make it muddy, cover it with straw, put seed down, and get a healthier situation going that way. With dogs, it's a lot harder because if you put something in the way, they'll just make a path somewhere else. Yeah, I don't know that I have a good solution for dogs. Sorry.
It's the compromise we have for having them in our lives. So we have Val asks, if I'm growing plants native to my region and adapted to my soil type, why do I need to test my soil first?
You probably don't. I mean, unless you see a problem, you could go ahead and do, you know, some people want that level of involvement. They want the perfect green lawn, and yes, they're going to naturalize areas around it, but they want the perfect green lawn. Or they're growing food and they want to make sure that they actually have nutrient dense vegetables and fruit that they're eating. For that, do a soil test. If it's your yard and you're willing to take the time, like it doesn't have to be perfect this year. If you see a problem this year, okay, then maybe you do need to do a soil test, but not everybody needs to.
Excellent. So we have an anonymous attendee who questioned, why do weeds and invasives do so well in even the worst soil, but the plants we actually want need these specific soil traits?
So nature. Nature designed what we generally call weeds. Nature designed those plants to go into really crappy soil and die. And by dying, add organic matter and make it better. So when you see a dandelion wherever in your yard, in your lawn, in your garden, if you pull that and you throw it in your compost pile, you're actually adding mineral and some really good stuff to your compost pile because that dandelion is a dynamic accumulator. So it's actually pulling up all sorts of nutrient into the plant. And as that's breaking down, as long as your compost pile doesn't go anaerobic, you will have that embodied by microbes. And so you'll actually be getting some nutrient value as well as organic matter and microbes from your compost.
Makes sense. So what are your thoughts on soil conditioners? Amanda asks.
Depends on the soil conditioner. One soil conditioner that is fabulous that I love to use is worm castings. When I first bought the house I'm in, you know, the first year I was rehabbing. I had no time for outside and I had dumpsters parked on the lawn. So got the dumpsters off the lawn. I still didn't have time to put a garden in, but I just got worm castings and put them in a cup and just shook them out. Not a whole lot. I mean, one bag, I did my whole yard, a small yard, but still. The next spring I had Scilla come up. Now it's not a native plant, but they were bulbs in the ground that the neighbors hadn't seen in years and that I hadn't seen the spring before because there was just nothing in the soil in terms of microbial life. The worm castings brings some level of microbial life. It's not diverse, so you don't want to only use worm castings or only use worm tea, but it's one of the materials that you can use as a soil conditioner that is just fabulous. And worm tea, if you raise worms, if you throw your kitchen waste into a bucket for worms, that worm tea is like crack for plants. And it's healthy, so it's not quite like crack. But I have seen a tree that had been in a pot for like 3 years, started to leaf out, gave up. I put a tablespoon of worm tea, which is quite different from compost tea. It's just the liquid coming out of the bottom of the worm, wherever you have them living, in a gallon of water, watered that tree in the pot. And I wish I'd put a camera on it overnight, because the next morning it was leafing out. It's almost spooky. It's almost creepy, but it works really, really well.
Science is cool. Val asked a question that actually I was texting my colleagues at Deep Roots about a little bit ago, is where do you get healthy compost? Because when I think about like windrows and like big industrial compost, it seems like it kills a lot of stuff on the inside.
It really does. Plus, if EPA is involved in it, EPA thinks about public health, and so they will make them take the piles. If, for instance, they're putting meat or milk into the compost, they will have to take that compost to 180 degrees. Well, I didn't even cook meat to 180 degrees. I mean, it kills everything. Yes, it kills the pathogens, but it kills all the good guys too.
So you prefer your compost medium rare? Sorry.
I do. NOFA, the New England Organic Farming Association guidelines say if it gets to 130 degrees for 4 days, it will kill any weed seed. And if it starts to go over 130, turn it. Because that way you won't lose as many as of your good guys. You'll lose some, but not a lot. I've seen some people make really incredibly good compost in their yard. I've seen someone who's making it commercially, but not in very large quantities. He had a PVC pipe with air blowing through it to aerate the compost, and it was all very technical, and it was $325 a yard.
So I think part of what I'm hearing you say is if you fancy yourself a good baker, maybe you should take on learning how to compost in your backyard to get the really good product.
Yeah, and there are all different kinds of ways of composting. So on the USDA website, there are 4 pages just on ways of composting that Elaine Ingham wrote. David Johnson from New Mexico State has a Johnson Sioux composter. Don't take shortcuts. And it takes a year with a Johnson Sioux composter. It's not going to be ready in 3 months. Elaine can produce compost in 3 weeks. Both of those composts can be really rich in microbial population, but it does take some doing.
I'm going to ask one really quick question because there were several people who were asking this for some good native plant examples of green mulch or living mulch, excuse me.
So rose verbena is one. Oh boy.
Pacra obovata is one of my favorites.
Yes, yes, pussy toes.
Wild ginger, is that one?
Oh, wild ginger I love. Now, if you're using wild ginger in a place that you're going to let it get dry at all, it's going to go dormant in the summer and you won't have leaves. If it has steady moisture, if the soil's in good shape and it's got some shade, you'll keep the ginger leaves all summer. Yeah. What else?
I think those are some, and I would encourage our viewers to go to the Missouri Botanical Garden Plant Finder is a terrific place to do a search for native plant ground covers. Is probably where I would start. Look for things that are native to Kansas and Missouri. And then of course, all of our local native plant nurseries are an excellent resource, not only for helping you find the appropriate one for your yard, but then also sourcing it for you. So
Exactly.
Hilary, this was terrific. Thank you so much. So much to learn and so many questions that we didn't get a chance to answer. Thank you everyone for being with us and asking great questions. And as we close out the webinar in a few moments, we will be sharing a short survey that will help Hilary and Deep Roots improve the programs that we offer you. I also encourage you to visit our website where you can learn more about native plants and how you can support birds, bees, butterflies, and more right outside your own front door. Finally, while you're there, we deeply appreciate your support of our ongoing native plant education efforts. You'll find the donate button in the top right of our homepage. So I think that is it for this evening, and we'll see you next time on March 30th for a webinar with Mary Nemesek, where she talks about how to create a bird-friendly yard with native plants. So virtual applause for Hilary. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening, and thank you for your humor and expertise. And I learn from you every time I see you, even if it's virtual.
It's wonderful. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Cheers.
Bye-bye.